The central idea of this channel is that human existence is shaped by an underlying pattern, a pattern I call the human condition. If you haven't seen our other videos, you'll want to go back and check those out to understand what this pattern is. In this video, we will examine how this pattern relates to the writings of 19th century Danish philosopher and Christian Søren Kierkegaard. Søren Kierkegaard was a Christian existentialist thinker in the early and mid-1800s. He was primarily interested in asking questions about the self, about lived human experience. He criticized philosophy for becoming overly abstract and detached from the lived reality of flesh and bones. He says, quote, "What I really need to get clear about is what I must do, not what I must know." He wanted to, quote, "lead a completely human life and not merely one of knowledge." What use is knowledge, or psychological insight, or metaphysical deductions, if they don't change how we act and relate to the world around us? The prominent psychoanalyst Carl Jung said similar in his Reflections, quote, "One has not really understood something until one has lived it." So how does Kierkegaard view this lived individual experience? Kierkegaard sees the self as a synthesis between two poles, the infinite and the finite, the eternal and the temporal, possibility and necessity. The goal of life is to strike the proper relationship between these two poles, and it is only in this proper harmony that we can rid ourselves of despair. For Kierkegaard, we all live in chronic despair. It is an inherent condition in mortal human life. Whether we recognize it or not, we are living in despair. The only way to resolve this despair is to become a true self by relating the finite and infinite in ourselves in a harmonious manner, a condition Kierkegaard considers extraordinarily rare. Despair, then, is our norm and can manifest itself in different ways, depending on our relationship to these two poles. We will cover three types of Kierkegaard's despair. The first, the despair of finitude. This despair of finitude is finite, base, restricted, and totally grounded in the temporal. This relation towards life is materialistic and immediate. It's all body and no mind. The despair is a result of our neglecting the infinite. A human is a synthesis between these two poles, and the despair of finitude ignores or represses the infinite, the divine. Entirely consumed by the trivial and the day-to-day pursuits of life, this person has no relation to the eternal and may not even recognize that they are in despair. This is probably the most common type of despair that we see today. Instead of surrendering to something transcendent, this is when a person, quote, mortgages themselves to the world. These people wholly identify with the temporal. They lack possibility and just go along with the crowd, doing what is expected and following the set path. The following examples aren't perfect, but they might convey the general idea. A character such as Woody, at the beginning of the movie, is entirely identified in his temporal role as Andy's favorite toy. When this role is threatened, Woody is completely unmoored, and his despair becomes more evident. Because he lacks any higher purpose, he is an easy target for anxiety and worry. Another example of this might be Bob Parr, Mr. Incredible, who in a way gives up on possibility and purpose and confines himself to superficial, menial work and mindlessly adheres to the expectations of society. He represses his own aspirations to something and as a result lives in chronic despair. This could be you if you lack reflection, depth, ideals, or a longing for the eternal. The second type of despair is the opposite, the despair of infinitude. In this type, we lack finitude, we lack what is concrete. We drift off into Neverland and abstract into abstraction. This person might spend hours reading about noble ideals and melt with sympathy for mankind, but they can't stand their next-door neighbor. They squander themselves in useless knowledge and fail to pull it down into the finite world. They might be a scriptorian or a philosopher who spends years in meditation and study, losing themselves in the infinite, but by doing that, they are in despair because they have neglected the self of flesh and bones. They could be a romantic idealist who constantly proclaims noble ideals and sentiments, but then does nothing in their life to bring them into reality. We might see an example of this in Buzz Lightyear, a character so obsessed with a higher purpose and calling that he denies who he really is in the finite world. Buzz cannot come to grips with his own limitation and his physical reality. He lives only in the ideal, and this brings despair upon himself. Another example of this might be Walter Mitty from the movie The Secret Life of Walter Mitty, who daydreams himself out of reality so he can live a higher and more idealistic life. Mitty is caught up in lofty ideals and escapes into fantasies as a way to avoid the reality of his life. He fails to act and only thinks. These dreams are him fleeing from the mundane reality of his finite self. This could be you if you are given to too much intellectual exercise in pursuit of ideals and knowledge, without actually engaging with the everyday world around you. The third type of despair is the despair of defiance. This is when a person is fully conscious of the infinite and the finite, of the divine and the earthly, but instead of surrendering to the infinite in their finite life, they actively will to be themselves on their own terms. A great sense of inadequacy and tension arises when we are fully aware of the two poles, of our own failures, limitation, and weakness, in contrast to the perfection, omnipotence, and goodness of the divine or the infinite. Instead of, quote, resting transparently in the power that established it, and accepting dependence on a higher power, a person in defiant despair shakes their fist at heaven and asserts their own values. They become a victim and use their victimization as evidence against the infinite or divine. I will make myself whatever I want to be, it says, and thus it avoids painful truths about itself. Kierkegaard considers this to be demonic. Examples of this sort are often celebrated in society today. We might see an example of this in the movie The Greatest Showman. This defiant despair is portrayed when characters, feeling a sense of inadequacy, become embittered and attempt to define themselves on their own terms. These characters feel an inner tension. They know they do not measure up, albeit this is in relation to the rich and popular class, and not necessarily the infinite. Instead of resolving to overcome these inadequacies and find stability in the divine, they resolve to arbitrarily assert their own worth on their own terms, and are thus in despair. This is also portrayed in Frozen through the character of Elsa. Elsa's defiant despair is captured in her attempt to escape and assert her own autonomy, thinking that she must control her powers and emotions on her own terms. She isolates herself from her family, gives up on relationships, and shakes her fist at the universe for her own failures. She flees her duties and wants to rule over herself and create herself, making herself into whatever she wants to be and not who she should be. I call this individual expressionism, and we see it everywhere today. It's a rebellious affirmation of our current flawed selves. It says, I am free to be me. It is a rejection of growth in favor of shallow self-affirmation. The primary focus of this attitude is to be what one is, instead of become what one should be. The demonic thing about this is that a person knows they are living in defiance of truth, at least at first. Their despair comes from their unwillingness to be their true self. Instead of working through this, they take up a self-deceiving attitude in an attempt to affirm who they are as they currently are. Spiritually understood, man in his natural condition is sick, says Kierkegaard. He is in error, in an illusion, and therefore desires most of all to be deceived, so that he may be permitted not only to remain in error, but to find himself thoroughly comfortable in his self-deceit. On the same note, Carl Jung said, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls." So how does this relate to the human condition pattern we have laid out in other videos? Kierkegaard's versions of despair, I think, can easily be understood in context of this pattern. Kierkegaard similarly sees a tension between two poles, finitude and infinitude. The goal of the self, he says, is to strike the proper relationship between these two poles. Despair comes from being either too entrenched in the finite, despair of finitude, or the infinite, in the despair of infinitude. Or despair comes from seeing the gap and rebelling against it, in the despair of defiance. Kierkegaard tells us that oftentimes we are in despair without even knowing it. In all forms of despair, we are what I call the bubble. In the despair of finitude, we deceive ourselves into a position of illusion, where we ignore the infinite, the what should be, by falsely drawing the ideal down to us like a golden calf. This is being in the bubble. In the despair of infinitude, we construct a Tower of Babel upwards to the ideal, thinking that we can opt out of the finite, the what is, and live in the ideal without engaging in reality. This is also being in the bubble. In the despair of defiance, we are willing to see the gap between the finite and the infinite, between the what is and the what should be, and we shake our fist, declaring that we can be whatever we want. We plant our feet and blow a bubble of individual expressionism, asserting ourselves on our own arbitrary terms. This is also being in the bubble. Getting out of the bubble requires us to break out of self-deception and see things honestly and courageously. This is hard to do, as Lord Edward Lytton acutely observed. The easiest person to deceive is one's own self. But doesn't the bubble provide relief and comfort from our own limitation and inadequacy? Kierkegaard would actually say no. It's all despair, even if we don't consciously recognize it.